Rancher lost his voice to trauma. Until the Bigfoot whispered her name. He hadn't spoken in years. Not since the day he buried her name under the cold western dirt. The winds still whispered at Lily, but his voice stayed buried with her. Until one night, something stirred in the trees. A small figure emerged from the mist. Eyes wide, hands trembling. It wasn't human. But it remembered. It held her scarf, and in a voice not its own, it whispered Lily. The rancher fell to his knees. Tears came first. Then, like thunder cracking open the sky, his voice followed. Lily, he whispered back. He hadn't saved the creature. The creature had saved him. Because some names don't die. They just wait. For someone brave enough to speak them again. Before we begin, take a moment to comment the name of your city, where are you watching from tonight, and when the story ends. Don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. The wind crossed the open hills of Montana like a ghost that refused to rest. It howled through the pines, rattled the tin roof of a small cabin, and slipped through every crack like a whisper that never stopped. Inside, a man sat alone beside a dying fire. His name was Ethan Cole, a rancher who once had a family, a voice, and a reason to live. Now, he had only silence. 3 winters ago, his daughter Lily was taken by a river flood that came without warning. That night, something inside him broke. His voice vanished. No scream, no cry. Not even a word since then. Just the sound of firewood cracking and the faint echo of memory that refused to fade. He held her photograph between calloused hands, a small smile frozen in time. The firelight flickered across his face, hollowed by years of quiet. Outside, the night deepened, and the wind began to shift. It wasn't the same as before. There was rhythm in it, like someone breathing. Then, through the noise of the storm, came a whisper. Faint, familiar. It carried her name. Lily. Ethan froze. Every muscle in his body tensed. His chest tightened as if the world had stopped breathing with him. He stumbled to the door, lantern shaking in his hand. When he opened it, the night was vast silent except for the whisper that drifted once more from the forest. It called again, and in that fragile sound, buried beneath fear and disbelief, Ethan felt the first spark of something he hadn't known in years. Hope. Part 1. The Whisper in the Woods. The woods were a blur of shadow and fog, the kind that swallowed light and sound whole. Ethan Cole stepped carefully along the narrow trail behind his ranch. The path that once led to the old river bend the same river that had taken his daughter 3 winters ago. His boots sank into damp moss, every step echoing louder than he expected in the still air. The lantern in his hand flickered like a heartbeat, its glow trembling with each gust of wind. Above him, the moon hid behind thick clouds, letting only slivers of cold light bleed through. The trees loomed like tall, silent witnesses, their branches heavy with mist. Ethan's breath came out white and uneven. He shouldn't be here. He knew he shouldn't. But that whisper, that voice had carried something no wind could imitate. It wasn't the sound of memory. It was alive. He paused, straining to listen. The forest was so quiet it pressed against his ears, amplifying the soft ticking of his lantern's glass. Then, faint and drawn out, it came again, this time clearer, closer. Lily. Ethan's heart jolted. He turned sharply, raising the lantern toward the sound. The light wavered across the trunks, carving shapes in the fog, shapes that could be anything: ghosts, memory, or madness. "Who's there?" he tried to say, but no voice came out. Only a dry rasp of air escaped his throat. His silence mocked him. Even fear couldn't give him back his voice. He stepped forward anyway. The whisper had come from deeper in the trees, beyond the line where the ground dipped toward the marsh. He knew that place. It was where Lily used to chase fireflies before the flood. He remembered her laughter, small and bright, breaking through the sound of rushing water. And now, in that same place, her name drifted back to him on the wind. He tightened his grip on the lantern and pushed through the low-hanging branches. Leaves brushed his shoulders, damp and cold. The air smelled of pine and decay, that old, earthy scent of a forest keeping secrets. Then the light caught something strange. Ethan froze. In the mud just ahead of him was a footprint, large, wide, and deep. The toes were spread, bare, human-like but enormous, nearly twice the length of his boot. He knelt down, touching the edge with trembling fingers. The impression was fresh, the water inside still rippling from his approach. Whatever had left it had been here only moments ago. He looked around. The fog swirled, forming and reforming shapes that disappeared before his eyes could settle. Every instinct in him screamed to turn back, to shut the door, lock the night outside, and pretend he'd heard nothing. But something stronger pulled him forward. Not courage, not reason. Need. He needed to know if the world had just spoken her name back to him. Another whisper drifted through the air, fainter this time, but real enough that it carried direction. Ethan lifted the lantern higher, the flame shivering. That's when he saw it. Between the trees, half hidden by mist, stood a figure, tall, broad, too tall for any man. The shape moved slightly, a shimmer of wet fur catching the moonlight. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His pulse thudded in his ears, drowning out the world. The creature didn't move toward him, didn't run, didn't growl. It simply stood there, as though watching him. Two dark eyes reflected the lamplight, steady, unblinking, strangely calm. For a moment, Ethan forgot to breathe. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him. Every branch, every drop of rain hung still in the air. He wanted to speak, to demand, "Who are you?" But again, no sound came. His throat tightened until tears burned behind his eyes. He felt the weight of all those years of silence, every word he'd swallowed since the river took his daughter. The creature tilted its head slightly, almost like it understood. Ethan blinked, and the shape seemed to fade into the fog, melting away like a mirage. Only the stillness remained, and the trail of prints leading deeper into the forest. He followed them for several paces, his legs moving on instinct, not thought. The footprints led toward the old birch grove, a place untouched since the tragedy. And as he walked, the whisper came again, close enough to brush against his ear. "Lily." He spun around. Nothing. Only fog and his own trembling hand holding the lantern. But he could feel something, a presence, not hostile, not cold, something ancient. Listening. Waiting. Ethan stood in the clearing for a long time, eyes darting through the haze. He looked down again at the massive prints, half filled with rain. He whispered inside his head, "Maybe I've lost my mind." But even as the thought came, the corners of his mouth twitched not a smile, but the ghost of one. Because madness, at least, meant there was still something left to feel. And tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Ethan Cole felt alive. He turned back toward the cabin, clutching the lantern close to his chest. The whisper didn't follow this time. Yet somehow, he knew the forest wasn't finished speaking. Behind him, the fog rolled over the footprints, swallowing them whole. But in his chest, beneath the ache of loss, something small began to stir a fragile spark that would not die. It was fear. It was grief. But it was also something else. Hope. Part 2. The echo of a name. The wind had risen by the time Ethan reached the edge of the clearing. It came hard off the ridge, carrying with it the scent of rain and pine sap, sharp and alive. He climbed the slope toward the ranch, boots slipping in the mud, lantern swinging wildly at his side. Behind him, the forest groaned, branches bending, whispering, hiding what he could no longer see. By the time he reached his porch, the rain had begun. Not heavy, not yet just thin, cold drops that spattered against the wooden boards. He wiped his sleeve across his face and glanced toward the barn, half expecting to see movement again. But there was only darkness, the kind that made its own sound. Ethan turned to the door, ready to lock it tight and end whatever madness had followed him out of the woods. But then he saw it, lying neatly on the porch step. Just beneath the lantern's swinging light was a small piece of cloth, soaked through, darkened by rain but still recognizable. He froze. The edges were frayed, the threads dulled with time. But he knew every stitch. It was Lily's handkerchief, the one she had embroidered herself when she was 8. The corner still bore her tiny signature, a single, delicate letter L. For a moment, the world tilted. The lantern light trembled, catching the silver of raindrops and the glint of his tears. Ethan dropped to his knees, reaching out with both hands. The fabric was cold, heavy with water, but the pattern of her thread was unmistakable, uneven, childish, but perfect to him. He pressed it to his chest, eyes closing. "Lily," he tried to whisper, but the word broke apart inside him. Only air escaped, warm against the storm. A flash of lightning lit the sky, and the cabin shuddered. The flame inside the lantern flickered, nearly died, then steadied again like it, too, was breathing with him. And then he heard it. Lily. This time the voice was closer, softer, clearer. It wasn't the echo of the forest now. It was a woman's voice, young, pure, gentle as the tone of a mother soothing a child. It carried over the wind, weaving through the sound of rain, finding him. Ethan's eyes flew open. He scanned the yard, heart pounding so violently he could feel it in his fingertips. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once above him, behind him, maybe even inside him. Lily. He mouthed again, gripping the handkerchief so tightly it nearly tore. The wind whipped around him, tugging at his coat, bending the porch lantern until its light danced like a heartbeat. The whisper came again, not a cry, not a ghostly call, but something alive, something that knew him. He rose slowly, unsteady, and took a few steps toward the yard. Rain hissed against the soil. The air smelled of metal and wet earth. Lightning flickered again, illuminating the pasture, and for an instant, he thought he saw movement near the tree line. a shadow tall, still, watching. Then darkness returned. Ethan's pulse thundered. He stood motionless, hand clutching the fabric over his chest, as if afraid it would vanish if he moved. He wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but his throat refused him. Only a rough exhale escaped, lost in the storm. Inside the cabin, the lamplight fluttered like a living thing. It pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, brightening, dimming, brightening again as if the house itself was aware of what stood outside its walls. He turned toward the door, finally stepping inside. The warmth of the fire greeted him, but even the crackle of wood felt foreign now, smaller, as though the world had shifted into some new order. He set the lantern on the table, dripping rainwater onto the floorboards, and stared at the handkerchief in his palm. The letter L glimmered faintly in the firelight. He traced it with his thumb, his breath shaking. How could it be here? He had buried this with her deep beneath the willow tree by the river. He remembered lowering it into the earth himself, and yet here it was, still wet, still warm from the rain as if freshly placed. Ethan sank into the chair by the fire. The light painted his face in gold and shadow. He tried to reason it through, but there was no logic left to hold on to. The world outside moaned under the storm. The windows rattled. The rafters creaked. And then one last time the voice returned. Lily. It was so faint he almost missed it, but it filled every empty place inside him. It wasn't frightening now. It was tender, filled with sorrow. Maybe even love. Ethan's head bowed. His hands shook. He pressed the handkerchief to his heart and closed his eyes. For the first time since the flood, he felt the heat of tears run freely down his cheeks. It hurt, but the pain was alive, human, real. Outside, the storm began to fade. The wind softened. The rain thinned to a whisper, almost like a breath, and the lamp on the table burned steady, its light warm and soft. Ethan inhaled deeply, the scent of smoke and rain mingling in his lungs. Somewhere deep within that silence, something inside him shifted, a faint spark of belief breaking through the ruin. Maybe he was losing his mind. Maybe it was grief twisting itself into sound. Or maybe, just maybe, the world had found a way to speak her name back to him. He looked down at the handkerchief again, thumb brushing the small letter stitched by a child's hand. His voice still refused to come, but his heart spoke loud enough for both of them. He whispered it without sound, lips trembling against the air. Lily. And for a fleeting second, in the quiet that followed, it felt as though the night itself whispered it back. Lily. Outside, the last drops of rain slid from the roof, falling into silence. The forest exhaled. And in that hush between grief and hope, Ethan Cole began to believe that the world was not done with him yet. Part 3. The Beast That Listens. The storm rolled in without warning. Lightning split the clouds above the valley, its light turning the pine forest into a flash of white and black. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of his porch, the soaked handkerchief still clutched to his chest. Rain hammered the roof, spilling down in silver sheets. He could barely see beyond the pasture, but his heart told him the whisper hadn't been the end, it was a summon. He lifted the lantern once more and stepped into the storm. The wind bit at his coat, rain dripping from his hat brim into his eyes. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself wanted to hold him back. The forest ahead swayed, dark and endless, and yet he kept walking, drawn toward something he didn't understand. The path behind the barn led through the pines, where the soil turned to mud and the roots jutted like bones. Lightning cracked again, lighting up the valley for a heartbeat, and in that flash, he saw it. A figure massive, still standing between the trees. For one impossible second, the rain froze mid-air, and Ethan's breath stopped. It wasn't a shadow this time. It was real. The creature towered above him, half shrouded in fog and falling rain. Thick brown fur clung to its shoulders, soaked and glistening. Its chest rose and fell slowly, powerfully, like the breath of something ancient. Its face was hidden beneath the heavy brow, but when the lightning flashed again, Ethan saw its eyes. They were dark, not empty, not wild but deep, human, aware. He took a step back, boots sliding in the mud. The lantern flame shook violently. The old instinct of fear screamed in his chest. Run. But the creature didn't move. It made no sound, no growl, no threat. Instead, it simply turned its head ever so slightly as though listening. The rain softened for an instant, just long enough for Ethan to hear his own breath rasping in the night. He raised his hand to his throat, trying once more to speak. His voice came out only as a rough whisper of air, broken, useless. He shut his eyes tight, teeth clenched against the frustration. When he opened them again, the creature had taken a single step forward, not toward him, but into the light. The lantern glow touched its face, now a mix of shadow and rain and quiet understanding. It looked at him, steady and calm, then lowered its gaze toward something in his hand. The handkerchief. Ethan followed its eyes, realizing it was watching the small, trembling cloth pressed against his chest. He clutched it tighter, unsure whether to hide it or hold it out. Then, slowly, the creature did something that stole the breath from his lungs. It raised one enormous hand and placed it against its own chest. A slow, deliberate motion, as if to say, "I understand." Then it pointed, gently, toward the handkerchief in Ethan's grasp. The message was wordless but unmistakable. Compassion. Recognition. Ethan's eyes filled. For so long, he had been unseen, unheard, trapped in a silence deeper than any forest. Now, under the storm, a being that should have terrified him stood there and listened. Thunder rolled across the hills, echoing through the pines. Ethan tried again to speak. The sound came, faint and raw, just a breath shaped like a name. L. Lily. The creature tilted its head, a low rumble leaving its chest, not a growl, but something softer, almost like a sigh. Its eyes shimmered in the lantern's flicker, reflecting the small, fragile hope that had survived in Ethan's heart. For a long while, neither moved. The rain fell steady, drumming against leaves and earth, wrapping the world in sound. Ethan lowered the lantern to the ground and stood still, staring at this impossible visitor. He could feel the thudding of his heart sinking with the rhythm of the rain, steady and alive. He had spent years buried under silence. Now, for the first time, silence was speaking back. The creature shifted, turning slightly, as if preparing to leave. It paused once more, meeting his gaze through the veil of rain. Then, with one slow motion, it pressed its palm into the mud, leaving behind a perfect print before stepping backward into the shadows. Ethan took a step forward, reaching out instinctively. but the fog swallowed the figure whole. Only the echo of rain and the faint scent of earth remained. He looked down at the print, wide and deep, filling with rainwater. His hand trembled as he traced its edge. The warmth of the encounter pulsed in his chest, not fear, not confusion, but something achingly close to faith. As thunder rolled one last time, Ethan lifted the lantern again. The flame burned steady now, no longer trembling. The storm still raged, yet somehow it felt quieter, gentler. He turned back toward his cabin, his boots squelching in the mud. Every step felt lighter than before. He didn't know what the creature was, or what it wanted, only that it had seen him. He had looked into the eyes of something beyond understanding and found not violence, but empathy. When he reached the edge of the clearing, he stopped and looked back. The trees stood still again, dark and endless. But somewhere beyond them, he felt it, that same quiet presence, listening, breathing, waiting. He held up the handkerchief to his chest once more. The rain had washed away the dirt, leaving only the stitched letter L, bright and clean against the fabric. And though the night remained vast and wild, Ethan Cole no longer felt like the last soul in it. He turned toward home with a heart still trembling. But for the first time in years, it trembled with hope. Behind him, in the distance, thunder answered like a heartbeat, slow, deep, alive. Part 4. The storm of voices. The night tore itself open. The wind screamed through the valley, rattling every board, every nail in Ethan Cole's cabin. The roof groaned as the storm hit full-force rain, slashing sideways, lightning tearing the sky into ribbons of white. Ethan stood by the window, heart hammering, staring into the blackness outside. Each flash of lightning lit the pasture like a photograph, brief, stark, and gone again. Then, in the roar of thunder, he heard it. Lily. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't the echo of the wind. It was clear, desperate, alive. The voice cut through the storm, raw and human, carried by the chaos itself. Lily. Ethan's breath caught. He turned toward the door, trembling. He didn't think. He didn't even grab his coat. He simply moved. The door flew open, the wind hitting him like a wall. Rain soaked him instantly, cold and stinging against his skin. The world outside was a blur of silver and black trees bending, the sky flashing, the earth quaking with thunder. Still, he kept walking. The voice came again, closer now, threaded through the storm like a heartbeat. He stumbled across the yard, the mud sucking at his boots, the lantern swinging wildly in his hand. Lily. The sound drew him into the trees, down the same trail that had haunted him for years. Lightning flared again, and for a single, blinding instant, he saw it, a massive figure, kneeling in the rain. Bigfoot. It was there, real, solid, and trembling like a mountain breathing. The creature's huge hands cupped something close to its chest, Lily's handkerchief. Rain poured down its face, tracing paths through the wet fur. Its head was bowed, and when it spoke, Ethan could hear the rough, broken tone of its voice. Lily. It wasn't a roar, it wasn't mimicry. It was sorrow, gentle, aching, human. Ethan froze, blinded by tears and rain. His lungs burned, and his knees nearly buckled beneath him. He could hardly believe what he was seeing, this great, wild thing kneeling in grief, whispering the name of a child it had never known. Lightning cracked again, close enough to shake the ground. Ethan raised his hand against the light, tears mixing with rain on his face, and something inside him, something buried under years of silence, broke open. He tried to speak. He wanted to scream. For 3 years, his voice had been trapped behind walls of pain and guilt. Now, the storm itself seemed to tear those walls apart. He staggered forward, water splashing around his boots, and gasped through clenched teeth, "L. L." The sound barely formed a broken gasp, a ghost of a word. The creature looked up, eyes wide and alive. Ethan pressed his trembling hand to his throat, forcing air through the rusted machinery of his voice, and in one great surge of will, of love, of anguish, of memory, he spoke. Lily. The name ripped through the storm. A single word, raw, cracked, imperfect but real. The forest fell silent for a heartbeat, as if the whole world was listening. Then thunder answered, not as a roar but as applause, rolling deep and long across the valley. Ethan dropped to his knees, breath shaking, the sound of his own voice still echoing in his head. Tears streamed freely now, mingling with the rain that ran down his face. Every nerve in his body trembled, not from cold, but from release. He looked up through the blur and found Bigfoot staring back at him. Their eyes met, human and wild, bound by something deeper than words. The creature rose slowly to its full height, rain cascading off its shoulders. It took one step closer, holding the handkerchief out toward him. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, it placed its massive hand over its heart, a gesture of understanding. Ethan swallowed hard. His voice was gone again, but his heart spoke louder than ever. He pressed his palm to his own chest, mirroring the creature. They stood that way, two beings broken by loss, united by grief in the heart of the storm. The wind screamed around them. The lightning burned the sky white, but neither moved. Ethan could feel the pulse in his throat, the voice that had finally returned, fragile and real. He whispered her name again, this time softly, almost reverently. Lily. The creature's eyes softened. It nodded once slow, almost solemn, then looked up toward the sky, releasing a long, low exhale that sounded like prayer. Thunder rolled again, gentler this time. The rain eased, falling steady but no longer violent. It washed the mud clean, carrying away the weight of the night. Ethan stayed there, kneeling in the rain, hand over his heart, until the storm began to fade. He had spoken her name. He had broken the silence. And in that single word, shouted into the wild, something inside him had been set free. Bigfoot turned then, moving back toward the trees. It paused once, just before vanishing into the mist, and looked back at him. For a heartbeat. Lightning lit the creature's eyes, and Ethan swore he saw kindness there. Then it was gone. Only the rain remained, whispering through the pines. Ethan looked down at the handkerchief now resting in his hands. The embroidered L gleamed faintly under the stormlight. He pressed it to his lips, closed his eyes, and let the sound of the rain carry the last of his grief away. The storm had taken everything once: his voice, his hope, his child. Tonight, it had given something back. Not her, but peace. Part 5. The Morning of Thanks. The storm was gone. What remained was silence, the soft kind that follows chaos, when the world itself seems to pause and breathe again. Dawn crept gently over the valley, pouring pale gold through the torn edges of the clouds. Mist rolled low between the trees, catching the newborn light like threads of spun glass. The pines dripped slowly, each drop of rain falling in rhythm with the waking earth. Ethan Cole stood on the ridge outside his cabin, hat in hand, his coat heavy with the scent of rain. The night had left him hollowed and trembling, but somehow lighter, as if the storm had taken a piece of his sorrow with it. The forest stretched before him calm, glistening, alive. He listened, waiting for another whisper, another echo of the impossible voice. But there was only birdsong now. Gentle, steady, new. He took a deep breath. For the first time in years, it didn't hurt. The air tasted of pine and ash and sunlight. Ethan turned back toward the cabin, boots sinking softly into the wet earth. The door creaked open beneath his hand, and warm light spilled out across the floorboards. The fire had burned down to embers, glowing faintly red enough to hold the night's memory without its fear. Then he saw it. On the table by the window lay the handkerchief. Clean, dry, folded neatly as if it had never touched the rain. Beside it, arranged in a perfect circle, was a ring of smooth river stones, each one small and pale, glistening with dew. Ethan froze in the doorway. His breath caught in his chest, a mix of wonder and disbelief. He stepped closer, eyes tracing the handkerchief's delicate embroidery. The stitched letter L shone softly in the morning light. He reached out, fingertips brushing the cloth warm to the touch. Impossibly warm. A faint smell of lilac drifted from it, the same scent Lily used to wear when she braided her hair by the fire. His heart clenched. He looked toward the window. Beyond the glass, mist drifted through the pasture. The trees stood still. And there, just at the edge of the forest, a single, enormous footprint pressed into the mud, already filling with sunlight. Ethan's lips parted, a whisper rising unbidden from somewhere deep within him. Thank you. The words were rough, cracked, but they were his. His voice real, alive, returned. The sound filled the cabin like a prayer. He said it again, stronger this time. Thank you. Each syllable carried everything he hadn't been able to say for 3 long years. The grief, the apology, the forgiveness. He sank slowly into the chair by the table, the old wood creaking beneath his weight. For a long while, he just sat there, hand resting on the handkerchief, eyes soft, lost in the quiet rhythm of dawn. Through the open door, sunlight slipped across the floor, painting golden shapes that moved with the wind. Dust motes drifted through the beams, glowing like tiny spirits in the air. The valley was waking, and for once, Ethan felt like he was waking with it. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and the sun wash over him. Behind his eyelids, he could almost see her Lily, laughing, barefoot in the grass, the same handkerchief tied around her hair. She turned once, smiling toward him, and the world went still. A tear rolled down his cheek, but this one wasn't born from pain. It was release. He whispered again, quieter now, not to the world, but to whatever spirit had bridged the gap between the living and the lost. You remembered her. A breeze slipped through the open door, stirring the curtain. It carried with it the scent of wet pine and something wilder, a trace of fur, of forest, of the being that had vanished with the storm, Ethan smiled, small and real. His first smile in years. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the forest beyond the window. The mist was thinning, golden light cutting through it, and for just a second, he thought he saw a shape move between the trees, tall, slow, graceful before the light swallowed it completely. He didn't rise. He didn't chase it. He didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was gentle, a silence that listened back. Outside, a few birds called softly. Somewhere in the distance, the river murmured. Life, once a cruel reminder of loss, now sounded like a hymn. Ethan turned the handkerchief over in his hands, marveling at how clean it was, how whole. Then he placed it back on the table beside the ring of stones, a quiet altar to everything he'd lost and everything he'd been given back. He rose, walked to the door, and stepped out into the morning. The sky above was soft gold, fading into blue. The valley shimmered with dew. At the edge of the forest, the last trace of fog lifted, and the great footprint gleamed in the sunlight before fading slowly beneath the warmth of day. Ethan took one last breath of the wild air and whispered to the wind, not in sorrow, but in peace, "Goodbye. Lily, I remember." The wind carried his words away, scattering them through the pines. He turned toward the open horizon, the light catching in his eyes. And for the first time in a long time, the man who had lived in silence walked forward, his heart steady, his voice alive, and his soul, finally, free. The morning stretched wide across the valley, painted in amber and gold. From above, the camera drifted slowly over the lonely ranch, small, quiet, resting at the edge of the wild. The fences gleamed wet from the night storm, and the fields shimmered beneath the rising sun. On the wooden rail, Lily's handkerchief fluttered gently in the wind, bright against the dark grain. Alive, with light. Ethan stood by the doorway, a faint smile carved across his weathered face. His eyes followed the horizon, where the mist still clung to the trees. Somewhere beyond that veil, he knew, the forest was watching back. A warm voice, deep, steady, timeless, filled the air. He found his voice again, because something wild remembered the name he could not say. The camera pulled farther and farther away, the ranch shrinking to a dot of gold amid an ocean of green and gray. The wind carried the last echoes of his whisper, blending them with birdsong and the hum of morning. Light swelled across the screen, soft, white, pure, until everything faded into silence. A new day began, and the wild remembered.